engagement there.
You're listening to Head South Radio with your host, Kat Meyer, a podcast dedicated to prioritizing pleasure and removing the stigma and shame around sex. We're here to be curious and have an open conversation about sexual health and relational wellness. This podcast is intended for educational and entertainment purposes. The information discussed is not a substitute for professional medical advice.
Hi there, I'm your host, Kat Meyer, and on this episode I am joined by Savannah Sly. Savannah is a sex worker who specializes in kink and BDSM and is an advocate for sex workers' rights. Savannah is the founder and co-director of New Moon Fund, a nonprofit dedicated to advancing the welfare of people in the sex trade, specifically sex workers. This conversation falls into a territory that is still extremely taboo. The sex industry is shrouded in harmful stereotypes, myths, and misinterpretations due to a lack of communication and stigma. It is our hope that by amplifying these stories, we can start to demystify sex work and the industry. Sex workers' rights are human rights, and it is time to recognize and protect them. By promoting the rights of sex workers, we can create a safer, healthier, and more just society for everyone. Find a comfortable seat and enjoy the show. So we'll start out finding a comfortable seat where you can kind of shift your weight around forward and back, side to side, and kind of just locate your sit bones. And then start to let the body settle into those points, to whatever you're making contact with beneath you. And then from that rooted, grounded feeling and experience, can you start to find some buoyancy through the spine? So finding lengthening through your spine. Your eyes can be closed or just soften your gaze. And then from this alignment, can you start to tune into your breath? So just starting to pay attention to the breath. You don't need to manipulate or shift or change the breath. And then just taking a moment to set an intention for this conversation, just a personal intention. And then setting an intention for our conversation and for the listeners, that anyone listening, that they might find something that they can relate to. Maybe this information can open up something they've never been able to explore within themselves. Maybe it gives validity to someone who's listening, who's been doing this work and feels isolated or feels threatened. And then when you're ready, just start to blink your eyes open. And so I'm very excited, Savannah, to have you on the podcast. I'd love for you to just give us a brief insight into who you are and the work that you do.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Kat. It's great to be here. My name is Savannah Sly, and I'm a longtime career sex worker who has specialized in kink, BDSM, and pro-domination, and I'm also an advocate for sex workers' rights.
And so just to kind of go back into your history and where you learned about sex, can you give us information about your sex education?
I count myself very lucky in that I had formalized sex education in high school. It was hosted through PE, physical education class, and it was about a week-long series, and each day they would go through different topics around mostly safer sex. And I realized later that not everybody got that chance to get that rudimentary education on, different kinds of safer sex methods. I think we got some information around potential abusive situations. It was pretty preliminary, but we had it. And it was in a co-ed situation. And occasionally they would separate the sexes to have different specific discussions around menstrual cycles or things like that. So the fact that we got that was in Vermont. And that was in the early aughts, probably around 2000, 2001. And I count myself very fortunate, but obviously I had more informal sex education before that in the form of discussions with friends, locker room conversations, talking on the bus, things like that. And I was already sexually active by the time I had sex education. So I had been picking up information along the way. But my mom was really great. We didn't really go in depth about sex or sex education, but I got just two very clear segments of information that were very helpful. One of them was, again, very rudimentary. It's when I had started dating and she realized that. And she came into the living room one day and I was watching TV and she's like, "You're dating?" And I'm like, "I am dating." And she's like, okay, I need you to do something for me. And she pulled out from behind her back a banana and a condom. And I was like, are you serious? And she's like, I just need to know that you know how to do this. And I put the condom on the banana and was like, fine, there. We were both embarrassed. And she's like, good. That's the only time we're talking about this. So that was one, that wasn't really a lesson so much as her confirming that I had the information I needed to make basic safety choices. But way before that, when I was about 7, I think I got the most valuable piece of education from my mom that related not just to sex, but to boundaries. She was helping me get dressed for school. And out of the blue, she turned to me and told me, this is your body. No one is allowed to touch you here, here, and here. And she pointed to my chest and my pelvis. And she said, if somebody does touch you there, you need to tell me. And that was it. That was the whole lesson. And I sort of instinctively knew that she was talking about something sexual, even though I had a very, very, very vague understanding of what sex even was. But I knew that she was talking about essentially molestation. You know, children can have an instinct for these things, even though I hadn't even heard many conversations about that. But I learned so much in that moment. I learned that this was my body and that I had boundaries and that no one was allowed to touch me in certain places. And I also knew that I had an adult who would back me up if somebody did. So I feel like that moment, which was less than 5 minutes, probably equipped me with some pretty important fundamental information that helped me protect myself and make decisions moving forward.
What I love about that too, it's a pivotal moment and it was short and direct, but it was also one that wasn't built on shame around your body. Like it was more of an empowering, like this is your body and it's for you to decide who touches it and what that experience is like. And I think a lot of people, women especially, are told about their bodies in a way that's like shameful and doesn't allow them to own their bodies. It's like you can't show that part of your body or you can't show your legs but I think what your mother did was a very clear and direct protection and safety boundary. It doesn't sound like you were riddled with any shame or confusion around that conversation.
Correct. And I have not had any shame or confusion around my body or my sexuality with sex work and public perceptions of sex work. I've found that's the only time that I feel any negative feelings about my sexuality is when I look at my sexuality from an outside perspective. If I look at my life through a societal lens, then I can feel shame or anxiety because I'm picking up what other people project onto the sexuality of individuals. But so outside of societal judgment, which I have been pretty immune from apparently for a long time, I have not experienced any shame or judgment around my sexuality. And I was able to be myself growing up. And I went through a phase as a teenager of dressing fairly provocatively and also very punky. I kind of had a Cyndi Lauper vibe going on. And my parents never shamed me. My mom did always check. She always asked to make sure I was wearing underwear when I left the house, which I always thought was bizarre. I'm like, of course I'm wearing underwear. What do you think I'm doing? And she's like, I don't know. It's just you have to wear underwear. So there were guidelines, and she was keeping an eye on me to make sure I wasn't off the rails or being too flirtatious, not wearing underwear around and wearing skirts. But I was let alone and able to be myself.
Kind of like a guide of not being overly exposed and vulnerable in certain situations or in certain ways of expressing oneself, but without kind of hindering your self-expression.
Yeah, exactly.
And then can you, like moving into sex work, can you explain or give background on how you got into sex work?
Sure. It's a story I've told many times. I'll give a bit of an abbreviated version here, but essentially I was 18 and going to art school in Boston, and I was broke as a joke. And I was working some minimum wage jobs part-time, but also trying to pay for photography supplies and rent for the first time. And it was just a real struggle. And I ended up stumbling upon sex work on Craigslist, not even knowing what it was. I didn't know what a happy ending was. I was looking at erotic massage listings. And to be frank, I was being really judgmental. I was sort of trolling the adult services section and being very judgmental of the women and people I saw posting advertisements there. As a photography major, I was very judgmental about the quality of the photographs I was looking at. And I just thought the whole thing was really skanky. And I was kind of just morbidly scoping it out. And then I stumbled upon a post that said, sex for money is illegal, work in erotic services. And it was a hiring ad for fetish and fantasy work and massage with a happy ending. I had no idea what any of that meant except for massage. Oh, topless massage with a happy ending. I knew what topless massage meant, pretty straightforward. And I was clearly comfortable enough in my sexuality to sign up for that kind of work because I picked up the phone from my parents' landline in Vermont and I called the number. I'd been home on Christmas break, being broke and looking at Craigslist, and I just called this number, left my legal name from my parents' landline, and I got a call back the next day. To my horror, because I realized what I had done and like not discreet, not very careful. And then I got connected to a man who ended up hiring me in Boston to do topless massage. And on my first day, there was a woman who was slightly older and she was training me. And she was like, this is how we set up a session. We put out a towel and some tea lights and some music. And they come in and they start on their stomachs and we take our tops off. And I'm like, all right, this is fine. And she's like, we give them a massage and then we flip them over and we massage their front and then we give them a hand job. And I had to stop her right there. I'm like, we what? And she's like, we massage their front and give them a hand job. And I'm like, we give them a hand job? I was totally flabbergasted. I had no idea that was part of the job. And she kind of realized how naive I was. And she sat me down on the edge of the bed. And she said, you don't have to do anything you don't want to do. But yeah, that's what a happy ending is. That's why they're coming here. It's the main part of the job. You don't have to do this. But then she started asking me some questions like, are you a virgin? Have you ever dated? What are your feelings about sex? And I answered honestly. And she's like, okay, well, I suggest you try this. You might be surprised, but you can also leave if you'd like to. And so I decided to try it. As I decided to do that, I got this terrible anxiety, panic feeling in my solar plexus. And I've come to recognize that feeling. It really only happens once whenever I try a new sex work modality. When I first tried performing on camera, when I first stripped, or when I first escorted, I got this terrible, tight anxiety feeling right in the center of my body that went away immediately as soon as the work started. So as soon as the door opened and this man came in and we started our session, that feeling evaporated and never came back. And I actually went right into a flow state with the work. It was very natural. I had fun. And, we did the whole thing and it was pretty effortless, frankly. And then while he was in the shower, we were counting our money and I was sort of dumbfounded at how easy it was. I felt good. I felt like I had just given somebody kind of a healthcare related experience. Not to say that sex workers are necessarily on par with like nurses and stuff, but it was of the body. And it clearly gave this person a lot of therapeutic benefit and joy. And it was easy for me and I had cash in hand. But that feeling that never came back, I've come to recognize that terrible gut anxiety feeling as societal judgment that I'm carrying in myself. It's a bright red line that you're not supposed to cross into whoredom, essentially. And the anxiety is knowing that you're doing something that the world tells you emphatically not to. But you know what? That is somebody else's rule. That was a bright red line made up by a society that is pretty sex negative, to put it lightly. And in my personal choices, I feel fine about my choices. And it's really only when I assume a more societal perspective and look at my life from an outside eye that I feel any anxiety or stress or shame about my work. If left to my own devices, I feel just fine about it. But that's how I got started, was in erotic massage, not really knowing what I was doing.
Yeah, I was visually picturing like your solar plexus lighting up and tightening. And one of my friends has this saying of like, if you're anxious, do it. Like that's what that's telling you. We sometimes read that as like, oh, I shouldn't do this. This is scary. But oftentimes it is that it's building up to try and kind of pull you away from that. But it's like your purpose or what you're meant to be doing is just on the other side of that. The filter of society kind of building up inside of your chest could have easily like made you pull back or pull out of something. And that might be also a signal of like, oh, this doesn't feel safe. But it doesn't sound like it was ever anything that was like, oh, this doesn't feel safe. It's more of this is a societal pressure. This is me hearing and filtering through that. And then I'm going to break through that.
I love that perspective of this is, if you're feeling this, push through it. And it is important for me to know it's not a feeling of danger. It's not my inner voice or my intuition telling me, don't do this. This is unsafe. It's a sick feeling. And I really do believe that it is just all the social conditioning that I and others have ever had around sex work specifically. I've never had this feeling around my personal sex life, hooking up with someone, experimenting with having sex or relationships with people of various genders or backgrounds, or even experimenting sexually in BDSM or other kinds of taboo, unconventional forms of eroticism. I've really only had it within sex work. And I do believe it's because sex work is one of the most taboo undertakings a person can experience in this society. I think it is more taboo than BDSM or being queer. I have my theories as to why, but I feel like it is that societal conditioning. And again, once I push through it, it never comes back. And I feel really solid about my choices. So it's just always something I've reflected on, especially lately after being a sex worker for 20 years and also seeing other people go through their journeys. I think, especially porn performers, sex workers suffer some pretty deep mental health problems. And I think that could be for a variety of reasons. And each person has their own individual experience and life to account for with their mental health. But sex workers bear the weight of societal judgment. And the more public you are, if you are a porn performer, you're being fetishized and sexualized, and hopefully you're earning money from it. And hopefully it's a choice that you are making. But I think at the end of the day, if people are vulnerable to taking on all of that societal judgment, all those millions of people watching you and judging you, I think that that can have incredibly detrimental effects on an individual, especially if they don't have a strong peer support network. And a lot of people feel these stresses and they might regret their work. And sex work is not for everybody, certainly, and people should think long and hard before they get involved. But I keep coming back and questioning. It's like the negative aspects of sex work. Is it really the work itself? Or is it the way that we feel in relationship to society? Is it the way that society treats sex workers on multiple levels? I think it can be both things. For me, the real stress is in how society treats sex workers, which is one reason that I'm really passionate about protecting people who choose sex work as an occupation.
Yeah, I think because in this past year that I've been working on Head South and meeting with and like learning lots, one of the things that's come into my perspective and shifting the narratives I've had, which I've always been very supportive of sex work and kind of understanding, but not understanding why. But I've been able to, in the past year, relate it to, and I kind of mentioned this off recording, the therapeutics of it. So how you had said there's definitely this therapeutic experience. And this came from, I had a conversation with someone who I was hoping to have on the podcast, and unfortunately they had backed out due to the stigma. But they were someone who has a master's in human sexuality and gives talks and is on podcasts and interviews about human sexuality and the academia behind it. But then they also, post-pandemic, needed to earn some more money and became a BDSM kink sex worker. So they had this duality. And when we were talking, I realized like, oh, you're applying the same information to the clients or the patients or the people that you're working with from a very societally accepted therapeutic experience. And you're applying that work in the dungeon that you work at night. And we kind of briefly discussed that, and I was kind of trying to frame that of like, that's where I'm starting to see this. And I work in yoga, I work in wellness. And one of the things that I had seen that you had written about was the archetypes in BDSM work and your relationship to BDSM work, sex work, and the theatrical nature of it. And I'm viewing it as also the therapeutic nature of it because I don't see a difference if someone, there's big differences, but there's so much work in allowing someone to be vulnerable, to be held. And so the work that I do with yoga and doing like one-on-one yoga sessions, and people cry and people have experiences, and I can see the similar experience within sex work. There's energy moving, there's experiences, there's being seen and heard, and some people who don't have access to even just affection in their day-to-day lives can access affection and intimacy and experience human connection on that level, or experience kink and things that they wouldn't have access to through sex work. So I've been viewing it as therapeutic, and then I had read that you were approaching it from a theatrical standpoint. So I'd love your take.
Sure, there's a lot of ground to cover there. And first thing I should start off is, for somebody who's patronizing a sex worker, a client. Clients tend to be cisgendered men, but there are clients who are women. A lot of couples experiment with sex workers, and then there's a lot of people who are gender questioning. And people arrive at sex work as a client for a lot of different reasons, a lot of different reasons. Sometimes it's pure entertainment. They want to go and have a sexy time and be aroused and get their rocks off, and that's that. And I'm in favor of that. I think that's fine. I think having an orgasm or being aroused can add a lot to your life. I don't see anything wrong with that as long as it's a respectful, consensual exchange of reciprocity. I'll give you something, you give me something. I think that approaching sex work for a purely entertainment perspective is just fine. But then there's all these other reasons. Sometimes a person may have a partner who has passed away. I've had clients who are getting over the death of their wife, and that's a very specific kind of experience, right? Where you're fulfilling companionship and you're also with them in their grieving as they're trying to learn how to connect with another person. And they're choosing a sex worker because dating can be overwhelming, and maybe they don't know what they want from a relationship, but they know that they want physical intimacy and sex. So that's one example. People with disabilities might want to see a sex worker because sex work can be a very non-judgmental place where it's kind of a one-way street. People want to give and receive pleasure. I think there's a myth that clients are super selfish and only want pleasure. Those people are out there for sure. There's lots of clients who are kind of just there to receive pleasure, but a lot of people also want to think that they are pleasuring their partner, even if they know that it's sort of play acting a little bit, right? So a person with disabilities, or a person who is not happy with their body or ashamed of their body, or people who have had relationship baggage, people who are dealing with things can see sex workers and they can experience being held, celebrated, becoming a sexual being. I think especially for people with disabilities, they're sort of infantilized and desexualized, but if they're adults and they have a desire to connect sexually with another adult, that is their right. And sometimes sex work can be a great place to do that. And then as far as, acceptance, touching upon BDSM and the archetypes, I love kink and fetish work because it's sort of like bring me your weirdos, bring me your super unique, nuanced fetishists. I am here for the really uncommon sexualities. I love it when people bring a script and something specific that they want to do that they have never been able to find a partner to do these things with. It's pretty common for somebody to have a fantasy, or it might be core to their sexual response, that either trying to explain it to a partner and, not getting dumped, or trying to find a partner who can do it for them can be deeply challenging. And I have a lot of empathy for these people. I have some pretty unusual fetishes myself. So I think I like to support people in this journey of being seen and having a good time and getting to really fully experience their sexuality. And sometimes that can mean doing very specific things in a way, in a sequence that is gratifying for them, and also with the right persona, you might say, or it could just be an exploration of archetype and persona. Sometimes people have fetishes or desires or fantasies that are not that uncommon. Let's take cross-dressing. You might have somebody who identifies as a man and they want to wear women's clothing for whatever reason, and there's a story around it. Either they're forced to, or they are a woman and they're kidnapped, or they're my girlfriend and they just live as like this. They're looking for an outlet to explore and justify a desire to feel a certain way. So, and just taking cross-dressing as an example, there can be some confusion. I love all the discourse today about all the different gender variants in humanity. Sometimes cross-dressers in a BDSM context can be mistaken for trans women, and sometimes they are. Sometimes they're newly embarking upon a gender journey and they're not sure where it's going to go, and maybe they do end up trans or non-binary or somewhere in between. But sometimes it's just the fetish and the taboo-ness, because let's admit it, it's still taboo for a man to wear women's clothing. They're looking to use that as a vehicle to feel a certain way. And the feelings they could be after could be vulnerability, being desired, being sexy, being so hot that the dominant, which is me, just cannot help themselves. And I just need to capture them and tie them up and have my way with them. And so this is where we're fulfilling archetypes of the damsel in distress, and I'm the bad guy. And the bad guy is going to ravish them. But there's all these different variations. The damsel in distress and the bad guy could be the princess and the knight. Maybe instead of tying them up and having my way with them, maybe I am worshiping them, and I'm treating them like a treasure, even though I'm doing something kind of naughty, because the knight really shouldn't be going to bed with the princess. Come on. There's so many stories that can be told in our heads and through our bodies and through role play that can be literal or not. I do a lot of really literal role play where it's like, I'm your boss, you're my employee, and the hot, naughty scenario is going to play out with power dynamics. Or it can be more subtle, where I'm in charge and you're not, and I'm just going to do things to you and I'm going to behave in a certain way that might make all these different movie reels sort of start playing in your head. We're playing on these ancient stories, these stories of power that we're really familiar with, but we might not be describing it literally. It's a pretty phenomenal thing that happens, and that's sort of where I think that a lot of sex magic occurs.
Can you explain sex magic?
Sure, there are some people who are way geekier about sex magic than I am, but I have witnessed and experienced and channeled sex magic, and it almost feels like a psychic energy where you are transmitting. There's a back and forth where you both know what's going on, even though you might not be talking about it. This is my brand of sex magic, and there's lots of different ways of accessing it. But what's magical to me is when I'm with somebody in an erotic or sexual context, and maybe we're making eye contact, maybe we're not, maybe we're having sex, maybe we're doing a bondage activity or something like that. But something happens where we're both watching the same movie in our head, despite no words about it being transmitted. I think that's really magical. I've had some experiences where I'm powerfully fantasizing about something with a partner and we're engaged in something sexual and we're getting really into it. And at some point, they just blurt out some words that indicate that they know what I'm thinking, even though they don't know what I'm thinking. It's hard to describe without going into specific stories, but it does feel like a psychic energy that can happen.
So have you ever participated in theater or theater programs?
Yes, I did a lot in elementary and high school. I was definitely a theater geek and very artsy. And so I studied theater in the classic sense of reading plays, writing plays, and performing them. I later went to art school in Boston and studied performance art, which I thought was really interesting. And performance art is where I started to understand the abstract and the surreal and how to convey meaning in a conceptually abstract manner, non-linear storytelling, non-storytelling, action as art, and certainly played with characters and personas in that. And then I think as a dominatrix, I've done some pretty serious study as well, but it's just day in, day out in the dungeon, not necessarily formal. It just is the work.
Yeah, because when you were describing the sex magic, it was kind of calling to mind improv work and then also just collaboration with somebody. So, like, there's what you're describing, yes, there entails sex work or some form of sexual outlet, but a lot of this is just theatrical, therapeutic work and co collaboration with another human and allowing like the boundaries and the safety of that dungeon creates a space for play, discovery, self-acceptance, and vulnerability that I see in like my meditation practices, in my yoga practice, in my life, and things that I'm trying to channel for my own creativity. when you're speaking of this, it's like sparking like, oh, this is the medium that you're working with is under the umbrella of sex work, but there's so much more in this. And I think so much more that people don't even recognize or see. Like they're thinking it's just like seedy, like how you were saying, like a skanky, seedy experience. And this is, to me, it just sounds beautiful, creative, and collaborative.
It can be, and it also can be skanky and seedy and shallow. Sex work can be all these things. It's a whole industry. It's like restaurants. Restaurants can be seedy and cheap and maybe gratifying in a comfort food kind of way, but maybe you don't feel great afterwards. Or maybe you get food poisoning, or you can go to a wonderful restaurant where the food is made with love and care in a beautiful environment. And also, like the restaurant industry, the people working in those environments have varying levels of satisfaction with their jobs, safety, respect, pay, and choice. So the sex industry is vast and complex. I only bring that up because I try not to glamorize or idealize it, nor do I try and vilify it. It's a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And it's really unfortunate that our society has a hard time holding complexity. Things are either good or bad. And I just refuse to take that stance with the sex trade. It is all things. But certainly when people are feeling totally autonomous and mutually respected in whatever way they need, and they can meet each other in a space, a container. I think of a session as a container, whether it's in a dungeon or a hotel room or out in a field. It's like, okay, we are beginning our play in the theatrical sense and our play in the joyful sense. I love calling sexual jaunts play because it is how adults exercise their imagination and experimentation and connection with each other.
So then that, I believe, leads me into the advocacy work and the validity and economic justice, the bodily sovereignty of sex workers. Because I love how you just related the sex industry to the restaurant industry. That was very clear and makes a lot of sense. And so can you speak to some of the advocacy work that you are doing right now?
Sure. Just to back up, I got involved in sex worker rights advocacy about 10 years ago in Seattle. And I did so out of a gut reaction response of alarm to seeing a lot of headlines about sex trafficking that were vilifying the entire sex trade. And it really reminded me of the war on drugs, which my family was directly impacted by. And so I very naively thought that if the people behind these headlines only knew that there was a lot of different kinds of sex work out there, that they would have a more balanced message in their headlines. And then I learned that actually it wasn't really news. It was a campaign. It was an anti-prostitution campaign that sought intentionally to conflate all sex work with sex trafficking, sort of like all drugs were considered to be deadly, even marijuana and things like that during the war on drugs. And I instinctually adopted a not on my watch kind of energy and attitude, and it felt imperative to push back against that anti-prostitution message because it was resulting in increased policing and surveillance and censorship of our local communities, shutting down our websites where we advertised, setting up sting operations to evict sex workers from local massage parlors and take them over and arrest hundreds of men in a weekend. A couple of my clients got caught up in this and arrested. Then just sowing misinformation of stereotyping the sex trade as all victimization and predatory behavior. And that is just really, really upsetting to me. And so 10 years later, here I am still working on this, but this work has taken me from grassroots activist, really showing up at town halls and yelling and waving signs to, working on policy in the legislature in different states, being a community organizer locally and nationally. And now I am the founder and co-director of New Moon Fund, which is a capacity building nonprofit dedicated to bringing more resources into the field of sex workers' rights through philanthropic education and some pilot programming for the movement. It's a surprise to me. I never, ever in a million years thought that this would be the work that I would be doing now. It feels so important. The basic humanity and human rights of sex workers are totally overlooked in a way that not only affects people in the sex trade and people connected to them, but it affects all of society. Here we are watching Roe v. Wade be overturned and our right to health care and contraceptives being taken away from us at a breathtaking pace. And then on the gender expression side, the attacks on trans youth and adults and the questioning of gay marriage. All of this, I feel, is made more easily possible when we allow for a whole segment of society, sex workers, to be criminalized and discriminated against so openly. People don't question it when a woman who did porn 10 years ago gets fired from her current teaching job. We just don't question it. It's like, of course, you were a whore. Or when somebody who is or was a stripper has their children taken away from them, or when they're deported, or even when they're murdered. Society has been deeply careless and has ignored the request for conversation and humanization from sex workers. And things have gotten so bad over the past 10 and 15 years under this, I think, propagandist anti-trafficking narrative that sex workers are coming out in droves. And that's why New Moon can exist. Funders are starting to wake up to the importance of this linchpin issue and seeing how it's connected to gender expression and bodily autonomy and women's rights and immigrants' rights and class and economic justice. I'm glad that you mentioned that one. So it's work that I'm honored to do, and I'm excited to see where it goes next.
The war on drugs is the war on people. And so absolutely this isn't to speak to not criminalizing sex trafficking and protecting the victims of sex trafficking, but they're lumping in people who are choosing and thriving through their sex work and lumping it all in and criminalizing everything. And it's also, from what I understand and see, they're not actually even protecting the people who are victims of sex trafficking. These laws and legislations aren't actually even being put into place as a protection and the human rights of the victims of actual sex trafficking.
I would agree with you. And it's sort of complicated what's going on. On the one hand, we have this incredibly binary narrative. The narrative was singular for a long time, where it was like all sex trade activity is sex trafficking and exploitation. And then sex workers like me come out and say, whoa, 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 no, sex work exists and it's not all trafficking and it's not, we're just trying to, at first we just start just by explaining that we exist and proving that we exist, which is also very dangerous to come out of the shadows as a criminalized person and be like, we exist, right? And then the narrative shifted to being like, it's mostly trafficking victims. And then there's some empowered, privileged, calling themselves sex workers, kind of professional sluts over here, but there's not very many of them. And we're mostly still concerned with, it's mostly all sex trafficking. And then we've had to further complicate the narrative to say, no, to divide us like that makes no sense. We are all people in the sex trade. We are all people with bodies engaging in some sort of commercial exchange by choice, by circumstance, or by coercion. And a lot of us have all three of those experiences at some point in our journey in the sex trade if we stick around for very long. And I'll bring it back to restaurants. It's like, it took me a while to secure jobs in nicer restaurants where I could earn decent money, have decent hours. It took me a while to understand my rights as a worker in restaurants. In some restaurants, I was sexually harassed all the time by management or clientele or kitchen staff. And I realized as a food service provider in the restaurant industry in Boston that, where I worked had a lot to do with my experience. How well off and independent I was had a lot to do with how I could advocate for myself. If I was really broke and it was hard to find a good job, then I was sort of subjected to these shitty options. And I think the sex trade sort of applies where it's like, I didn't mention it, but when I started sex work in that erotic massage situation, the women I worked with were great, but the man who employed me was awful. And he kind of turned out to be a pretty quintessential pimp. And he got worse and worse over time. He was coercing sex out of the migrant worker amongst us, threatening to get her deported for prostitution if she didn't sleep with him. He threatened me with a gun. He started taking oxy, and he was taking indiscriminate cuts of our money. And when we pushed back, he started threatening us with extortion and blackmail and calling the police on us, even though he was the one setting us up to break the law as sex workers. And so, long story short, we got together, we kind of informally unionized, and we fired him. And we started our own massage ring. That's when he started calling the cops on us. It's a long story, but like that experience at 18 really opened my eyes to the plights of migrant sex workers, to how sex workers of different ethnicities are treated, because I really worked with a wide array and wide diversity of women. And it taught me about how abusers can use criminalization to keep power over vulnerable people who are subjected to the arrest. And even after that negative experience, I mean, he was the negative part, the actual work itself, the women I was working for, the money I was making, the flexibility to my hours, getting to feel like a sex goddess. I was into all that. And so 20 years later, I'm still at it. But, you know, a lot of us have these dual experiences in the sex trade. So to divide people into either survivors or sex workers has limited utility. And again, we need to be having nuanced conversations about these vast economies. Things aren't good or bad. We can have good and bad experiences over the course of our life. But dating, for instance, I don't know about you, but I've experienced some violence in dating. I've probably experienced more violence in my personal dating life than I have in sex work. But I don't think of dating as bad. I think of it as risky, and I have to be informed about it. But we're not going to criminalize dating or marriage just because domestic violence occurs or date rape, right? Sex trade is much the same.
I'm just processing the what you were speaking to about your early experience and how the criminalization of sex work as a whole puts the most vulnerable in the marginalized groups within sex work at risk. And then that's where it then becomes like it's not a choice because this person is fearful of their livelihood, their life, their family. And the job itself, like what you were saying, is like actually pleasurable. It feels good. This is a choice that this person's making, but certain circumstances. And then this person who is manipulating and taking full advantage of the fact that this person could be a victim and criminalized for the work that they're doing. It's pretty fucked up.
I like to say sex work is great as long as you can choose it. As soon as you start having to do sex work, the feeling around it changes, at least for me and for a lot of people I've talked to. And so that could be literally somebody forcing you. Like if you have a boss and the boss is like if you're an escort and you work for an escorting agency or a brothel and they're like, you're going to see this client. And you're like, I don't want to see this client. They don't make me feel good. They're like, you're going to see this client. You're going to feel bad about that, right? As opposed to you being able to pick and choose your clients and deny service to whoever you wish, right? So that kind of level of autonomy. So there's the actual who's telling you to do what. But then there is the economic factor. Like if you are broke and you need money, you might have to see clients or do things that you don't want to do. And that's not going to feel good, right? As opposed to if you have some savings, you have some wiggle room in your budget, and you can decline certain activities or certain clients, you're going to inevitably feel better about your work the more control you have over it. And so there's a lot of people who don't like sex work. There's a lot of people who have had unwanted sex, but they're doing it because they have to keep food on the table, or because somebody's pressuring them, or because they're experiencing discrimination. I am terrified at what the rollbacks to queer rights in the United States is going to do as far as exploitation in the sex trade, because LGBTQ people are very powerfully represented amongst sex workers. And also we talk a lot about minors in the sex trade, and nobody wants minors in the sex trade. Sex workers don't want that. Society doesn't want that. But if you're a queer youth and you're living in an increasingly hostile environment, you might get kicked out of your house. If you're visibly queer, you will probably be denied employment or another place to live. You're experiencing discrimination on multiple levels. And so how are you going to get by? You know, street economies are there for people who don't have other options. So a lot of youth in the sex trade are there because there's just not another means of making money. Also on the emotional side, if you've been rejected by your family or your social group, and then somebody comes along and says that they care for you and you're going to be a team and you're going to come up together, that can turn into an abusive situation, right? Where you're being exploited for your labor for that person's benefit. And you have a sense of, you know, obedience to them, or like they're your friend or your boyfriend or whatever. So if we're really concerned about trafficking, we really need to show up for anti-discrimination and to protect people who are vulnerable to discrimination, like LGBTQ people, with an emphasis on trans people. for migrants. We need to work on migrant reform, so that people who come here, people on the move, have more options when they arrive here, and the sex trade isn't their only option. Because again, when people have more options, they have more control. If they choose to do something like sex work, they're much more likely to not have negative experiences. And that's just so important from a safety perspective. And that's another thing we advocate for at New Moon and within the sex worker rights movement, is we want people to have options.
As I'm hearing you, I'm listening and processing the idea of it's codependency. So whether I have not done sex work, but I've been in codependent relationships. And to your point of at a certain point when you feel like it's not a choice, I have to stay with him or I have to stay in this relationship because of XYZ. And you no longer feel that this is a choice for you and you can't get out of a situation, it feels fucking horrible. And so I love the creating systems and platforms to help people make the choices for themselves, make decisions with all of the information on the table. And so young people who, instead of thinking this is the only way, knowing and having other options, knowing and having safe spaces to live and go to, immigrants, people coming in who need safe spaces to live and relief so that they can make the decisions for themselves. And it's, to your point, it's showing and revealing something that we can easily ignore if it doesn't involve us. It's easy to kind of push sex work aside or see the headlines and be like, oh, good. But it's revealing the breadcrumb of a big, massive, really sour cake. It's kind of you're seeing the first signs of where things are going to start to really, really crumble and be really, really bad for everybody, society at large.
I'm so glad you're picking up on that, because we're here to defend ourselves and protect our right to be in the sex trade if we choose, and to also get access to services if we choose not to be here and we need assistance. But we're also here to sound the alarm. When we allow tyranny over somebody's body, especially a woman's body, about who she can and can't have sex with and under what circumstances, what are we setting ourselves up for? And where are we now? Just look at it. Sex workers are in many ways canaries in the coal mine for bodily autonomy, for freedom of movement, for privacy. And it's a whole other podcast discussion to get into what's happening with censorship and technological oppression to sex workers that is hot on the heels of affecting the whole population. It's already happened. There's already been congressional legislation that has greatly restricted our ability to have free speech on the internet. And that's kind of a whole other can of worms. But yeah, people should be concerned. We should be concerned about any group that is openly abused and dehumanized and regulated as other, openly criminalized just for being any group. We should be very much alarmed and focusing in on that, because they're the first of what is going to happen to pretty much all of us.
I absolutely think there is a whole nother conversation. I'm really excited. I do want to bring you back on to talk about OnlyFans and technology and the censorship even of legitimate brands, sex toy brands and products. Also the gendered issues around that. So we can have commercials on the subways about Viagra, but you can't actually have anything for female sex enhancement.
There's so much to talk about, and I hope that Head South never has any of these problems as a sexuality brand, right? Again, this is those are the rings of influence. They start with sex workers, and then it's sex toys and queer people, and then people having extramarital sex. It's a really slippery slope, and I would love to come back and chat anytime.
Yep. So I hope you have a lovely day. Thank you so much for sharing your story and your experience. I'm really honored to have had you on.
Thank you for having me.
Special thanks to all of our guests. Head South is hosted by Kat Meyer, produced by Isis Barlow, edited by Megan Hook, with music by Lily Rezi Rothman, graphics by Ella Chodos Irvine, cover art by Gina Ship Casey, and intro by Murph Meyer.